Welcome to the latest Astromovie review. In May, Saturn entered briefly into the sign of Aries, where it conjuncts Neptune, just before it retrogrades back out. It then fully enters the sign again in 2026. As an homage to Saturn's dip into this Aryan terrain, we've selected a film that speaks fully to the Saturnian archetype. We're going to take a look at Robert Zemeckis' survival film Castaway, released in 2000. The film stars Tom Hanks, who plays Chuck Nolan, an obsessively punctual FedEx productivity manager, and Helen Hunt, his long-term girlfriend, Kelly Frears.
I'll be right back!
What's interesting here is that we could have selected from among several of Hanks's films, because many of them do have Saturnian themes. Movies such as The Terminal, Sully, Joe vs. the Volcano, and even Splash. It's true that most films involve some sort of conflict, which tends to be shown by the slower planets, particularly Saturn and Pluto. But you might notice that many of Hanks's films involve being stranded on or near water. Modern astrologers might not know this, but water is very much connected to Saturn, and we'll get into this shortly. But for now, why does Tom Hanks seem to be drawn to films that have these marked Saturnian themes? So we're not going to spend the time to analyze his own chart here, since this is a beginner series, and we focus mostly on the themes of the planets in films, and not the charts of the creators involved in them. But we did check to see if Saturn was prominent in his chart. And while it isn't especially noteworthy in its placement, it is the manager of his career, and we can see its influence on his scripts, because it's placed on the third house of documents. Also, its dispositor is placed at an angle close to the cusp of the seventh. This tells us that his knowledge and communications, such as movie scripts, will play a pivotal role in his life, and particularly in working partnerships. But let's move on to a deeper look at what Saturn means, so we can get an idea of what to look for in the film. The first thing we should mention is the planet's Greek name, Kronos, which means time. Many English words indicating time are rooted in this original meaning, such as chronology, chronic, synchronous, etc. Saturn is the slowest of the visible planets, so it makes sense that the deity Kronos, who governs time, would rule over it. Saturn is often depicted as an old man because he indicates longevity and long lengths of time. This, of course, is the major theme of this film, and it gets portrayed in many ways, including in the pocket watch that Kelly gives him as a Christmas gift, which he sets to Kelly time to remind him of her when he's traveling. But Chuck is a FedEx productivity manager obsessed with beating time, and the whole conflict of the film revolves around his ability to survive a test of resilience and time by being alone on a deserted island for 4 years. Resilience, by the way, also a Saturn keyword. The film actually opens up with an example of how Chuck attempts to beat time by sending a test package from Seattle to St. Petersburg, Russia. This package is a foreshadow of what's to befall him because it fails to arrive on time by getting delayed transiting through Russia. As he points out to his employees, it manages to travel 9,000 miles from Seattle to Russia in only 32 hours, only to linger 41 hours in Russia to travel 4 miles. This is why Chuck flies to St. Petersburg, to get the Russians to improve their performance. Work, performance, commitment, and achievement are all Saturn themes. It's after all the planet that workaholics and high achievers embrace the most. Let us take a slight detour to talk about the city of St. Petersburg and the surprising coincidences that we ran into while researching this video. Of course, synchronicities are the bread and butter of astrology. Sometimes, though, they're just too good not to point out. As stated earlier, Saturn entered Aries just a few weeks ago, where it conjoined Neptune at 1 degree of Aries. A conjunction of these two slow planets in Aries occurs only once every 323 years. The last one was in 1703, the exact year that St. Petersburg was founded by the Tsar Peter the Great. Saturn is the deity that was originally a governor of canals and irrigation systems in Babylon. Later on in Greek astrology, it became associated with sailors and with the sea more broadly. Neptune, or Poseidon as he's called in Greece, is of course the god of the oceans, especially associated with storms at sea. Aries and the first month of the Babylonian calendar is also tied culturally to canals through the Akitu, a New Year's festival held during the spring equinox. The film's inclusion of St. Petersburg made us curious to know if it has any canals. And oh boy, does it ever. Those of you in Russia can tell us more about this in the comments, but it can be found online that St. Petersburg, Russia is famously known as the Venice of the North due to its extensive network of canals and rivers that crisscross the city. These waterways not only define the city's landscape, but also apparently contribute to its unique charm and character. In addition to its location on the delta of the Neva River, this means that storms from the Baltic are so frequent that it prompted the building of the St. Petersburg Dam, which lasted from 1978 to 2011. The city is also implementing the Agile Resilience Plan. There's that Saturn word again, resilience, to strengthen its infrastructure and enhance its ability to withstand future storms. There is another important aspect of Saturn that the film plays up during Chuck's stay in St. Petersburg. This is Saturn's ties to winter and increased darkness. Saturn rules over two subsequent winter signs, Capricorn, where the winter solstice starts the season, and Aquarius, the cold month of January, indicated by the water bearer, which again depicts Saturn's water connection, which by the way did not originate with Saturn but with the Sumerian god Enki. But that's a story for another time. The winter months are the months with the longest nights, therefore those during which the greater darkness prevails. This is especially so in the northern latitudes, such as in St. Petersburg. Chuck is there just before Christmas, at the time of the longest nights. This darkness theme also gets played with on the island where Chuck gets stranded. There, a storm forces him to hide in a cave, where his flashlight goes out and he's plunged into darkness. But in the beginning of the film, we see him in his Russian hotel room while the lights flicker. He seems annoyed and doesn't look up from his multitasking or his attempts to call Kelly. He simply mutters, "Those damn northern lights," as they cause the power to cut and plunge him into darkness. But Chuck is prepared. He's got a headlamp and continues what he's been doing, ignoring Saturn's calls for him to slow down. This is symbolic of his desire to conquer the limitations of Saturn, which is in reality what his job is all about. As the productivity troubleshooter for FedEx, he attempts to rob Saturn by chipping off microseconds from his employees' performance, telling them, "We don't have to accept the way it is." Necessity is the primary principle associated with Saturn because he governs over the lack of choice. And this is where the darkness comes in. The sun represents choice, options, and the will to journey onward. On the website, we have a whole talk about light in astrology, which you may want to check out. There'll be a link in the description. Wherever there is light, we perceive options to choose from. That then means that when there is darkness, there is a lack of choice, otherwise known as necessity. It's for this reason that work, commitments, and limitations are signified by Saturn. We all have to work to survive. In that, there is no choice. But it's also true that necessity is the mother of invention, because when choices are limited, it forces us to get creative and use our imagination, which is what solar light is all about. Light inspires creation, while darkness removes choice. This dialectic between choice and necessity is embodied in the two opposing signs ruled by the Sun and Saturn, that is, Leo and Aquarius respectively. So too, Chuck ends up doing battle with and confronting necessity by spending most of the film getting creative and inventive in order to survive life alone on a deserted island. Still, when we meet Chuck, he's a guy who doesn't much acknowledge or respect the power of Saturn. He lives consumed by Saturn's restrictions without actually respecting them. For example, he's so consumed with his work that he often neglects his relationship with Kelly, to the point where their delayed engagement becomes an annoying butt of family jokes. Commitments and delays are both Saturn keywords, because commitments restrict options and delays extend those restrictions. Commitments to our work or to accomplishing our goals, which is what Saturn tends to signify most frequently in charts, is what creates isolation from others, another very important Saturnian theme in the film. It's actually Chuck's obsession with perfection in his work that ends up crashing his plane and creating the literal physical isolation from others on a deserted island for 4 years. Another aspect of Saturn that is probably coincidentally depicted, as it's unlikely that the writers were consciously depicting astrological tropes, is its rulership of the teeth and bones in the body. In a scene at Christmas dinner, we find out that Chuck has also been neglecting a bad tooth that will later flare up while he's a castaway. Out of necessity, then, he's forced to extract the tooth himself by hitting his mouth with an ice skate that he unboxes from the packages that washed up on shore from his downed FedEx plane. In fact, in a poignant twist, it's also his dentist who ends up marrying Kelly while he's stranded on the island. Saturn is absolutely not toying with Chuck. Lastly, there's the issue of coldness. Astrologically, Saturn is the coldest of the traditional planets because it is the farthest from the sun. We start the film in one of the coldest, most northern major cities in Russia, very close to Christmas. This coldness is also symbolized in temperament. While Chuck is not really a cold person, he doesn't have the emotional warmth to be able to comfort his friend Stan, whose wife is dying of cancer. Instead, he awkwardly attempts to show his sympathy by giving Stan a referral for a specialist.
I heard about this doctor down in Emory in Atlanta. He's supposed to be the absolute best. He could get this thing fixed. You beat it.
And it is, in fact, a warm tropical island environment that transforms him. We've already mentioned the ice skate as a tool that saves his life in many ways. But on the island, he's forced to deal with all of the major Saturn issues that he's neglected and passively allowed to fester, much like his tooth. He confronts his loneliness by creatively becoming attached and talking to a salvaged volleyball that becomes his friend Wilson. When a metal porta potty washes up on shore, it inspires a creative plan of escape by turning the metal into sails and slowly building a raft from reeds. He appropriately says to Wilson,
"We live and we die by time, don't we? Let's not commit the sin of turning our back on time."
When he returns after his 4-year ordeal, he asks for 2 buckets of ice and says simply,
"I like ice."
a symbolic acknowledgement that he now recognizes that Saturn is a deity that he cannot fight and must integrate into himself. On that island, he even confronts Saturn as harbinger of death. In a beautiful scene after his return, he describes his aborted suicide attempt on the island to Stan by admitting,
The only thing I could control was when and how. I had power over nothing.
Control. It's another Saturn theme that presents itself to those who are very ambitious and determined. Often it takes an encounter of Saturn with Neptune to humble us into the realization that we have no ultimate control. As he chronicles, and yes, that was an intentional pun,
I stayed alive. I kept breathing. And then one day that logic was proven all wrong because the tide came in, gave me a sail.
his tone reflects the acknowledged surrender that we often encounter with Neptune, which, like its waves, erodes everything that is rigid. Stan tells him that they had a burial for him when they believed that he was dead. But tomorrow we're going to bring you back to life, he says. This is symbolic of Chuck's rebirth, much like Saturn in Aries, the first sign of a new cycle. The end of the film is also beautifully captured. Chuck goes to Marfa, Texas to deliver the single package that he never opened while on the island. It was his original test package from Russia, which he recognizes because it had 2 circled angel wings on the envelope. Angel wings are a symbol of freedom, divine protection, sometimes indicative of speed. After he delivers the package to the attractive woman whom it belonged to, he stands at a crossroads in Texas, a sunny state, and smiles. It's an appropriate symbol that his ordeal has ended and that choice and light are now fully back into his life. This was a great movie to rewatch and review. We hope you also enjoyed it and learned a bunch about Saturn's themes in astrology. If you did, please help us make more like this by liking and subscribing. It does help. And see you later with the stars.